In the second week of May 1943, in an olive grove a few kilometers outside Tunis, a group of American soldiers found something the United States Army had been trying to get its hands on for 6 months. It was not a document. It was not a prisoner. It was a 57-ton machine, still warm to the touch, its engine intact, its ammunition in the racks, its hatches closed. The Germans had walked away without destroying it. What the Americans discovered when they dismantled the Tiger months later revealed the extraordinary engineering behind Germany's most feared tank and the hidden compromises that made such a remarkable machine increasingly difficult to sustain in a long industrial war. To understand why the men who found that tank were shaking, you have to go back 3 months to a mountain pass in central Tunisia called Kasserine. In February 1943, American soldiers at Kasserine heard a sound they had never heard before. Deep. Metallic. Wrong. The sound of a Maybach engine idling behind a ridgeline. The sound of a tiger. The Americans at Kasserine were green. Most of them had never seen combat. They had been shipped across the Atlantic in the winter of 1942, landed in Morocco and Algeria under Operation Torch, and pushed east into Tunisia to meet the retreating army of Erwin Rommel. What they encountered on the 14th of February was not what they had trained for. Sherman crews fired at Tigers with the 75mm guns their doctrine had told them were sufficient. The rounds struck. The rounds bounced. 8 shells from a single anti-tank position hit the flank of one Tiger in the space of a minute. All 8 failed to penetrate. The crew inside the Tiger felt the impacts as light taps, like someone knocking on a door. By the second week of February, American headquarters was receiving reports of engagements that ended before they had properly begun. Armored units breaking off contact the moment a silhouette appeared on the horizon. Anti-tank crews abandoning their guns when they realized what they were being asked to fight. The military historians who later studied this campaign gave the phenomenon a name. They called it Tiger phobia, a fear that had grown far beyond what the actual numbers should have produced. The entire German war effort produced only 1,347 Tiger tanks. Against them, the Allies built tens of thousands of Shermans, tens of thousands of T-34s. The Tiger was statistically almost invisible. Psychologically, it was everywhere. It was on the other side of the world. A young man was learning what it meant to command one of these machines. His name was Alfred Rubbel. He was 21 years old. He was from a small town in what is now Western Poland, then part of German territory. He had wanted to be a tanker since 1939 when the war began. He had submitted 9 formal requests for transfer into the Armored Corps before one was finally approved. He had trained first as a loader, then as a gunner, and he had fought on the Eastern Front through the summer of 1942 in a Panzer IV. He was competent. He thought of himself as competent. He also knew, from the specific experience of watching Soviet Kf-1 tanks absorb his rounds without effect, that competence was not the same as sufficiency. His Panzer IV was outgunned by the Soviets. He had been asking for something better. In the late autumn of 1942, he was assigned to the 3rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, Schwere Panzerabteilung 503, an elite unit equipped with the vehicle the German army was betting the war on. His first night with the Tiger, Rubbel later wrote, began with an accident. He had been ordered to guard a train of newly delivered Tigers waiting at a rail station for morning unloading. It was cold. He climbed into the driver's seat of the nearest tank to get out of the wind. The ignition key was in the panel. He turned it. The engine started. That enormous engine, filling the winter air with the sound that had already begun to terrify Allied soldiers wherever the Tiger was fielded. What nobody had told him was that on a Tiger, the transmission was always left in gear. When Rubbel touched the steering wheel and gave the tank a light touch of throttle to see how it responded, the 57-ton vehicle lurched forward. The wooden chocks the loading crew had placed under the tracks were pushed out. The Tiger rolled to the edge of the rail flat car and stopped there, front and rear suspended in the air over the concrete of the platform below. Rubbel sat very still. He did not move his hands from the wheel. He did not touch the throttle. He waited for the sound of his own heartbeat to slow down, and then he continued to wait, because there was nothing else to do. The morning crew found him at dawn, still in the driver's seat. The Tiger balanced on the middle of the flat car, with the tracks hanging over both ends. There was no formal investigation. There was no disciplinary action. What Rubbel wrote about the incident many decades later, in a memoir published long after the war, was simple. From that moment, he said, he began to take the Tiger seriously and to study it thoroughly. It was not the introduction to the finest tank in the world that he had imagined, but it was an honest one. And in the story he was about to live through, honesty about the machine was going to matter more than any of them yet understood. 2,000 kilometers away, on the northern coast of Tunisia, the Axis position in Africa was collapsing. By late April 1943, the German and Italian armies that had fought for control of North Africa for 3 years had been compressed into a small pocket on the Cap Bon Peninsula, east of Tunis. The Americans and the British were closing in from 3 sides. The Mediterranean was behind them, closed by the Royal Navy. There was no evacuation coming. On the 13th of May, the last major Axis formations laid down their arms. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers walked into captivity, a defeat comparable in scale to Stalingrad, though it would receive far less attention in the histories written afterward. In the days that followed the surrender, American and British units moved through the abandoned positions of the defeated army. What they found was the debris of a modern military machine that had run out of everything: trucks without fuel, artillery without shells, field kitchens with cold stoves. And in that olive grove outside Tunis, in a shallow depression where the trees provided cover from the air, they found the Tiger, intact, the engine cold but not broken, the gun still in its cradle, the hatches closed. There was no fire damage. There were no shell holes in the armor. There were no bodies inside. The crew had walked away, and in walking away, they had failed to complete the one procedure that German armored doctrine required of them in any circumstance where their vehicle might fall into enemy hands. They had failed to plant the demolition charges. They had failed to destroy the tank. The men who found it were American soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, veterans of Kasserine, men who 3 months earlier had been running from tigers in the passes to the south. They stood in the shade of the olive trees and looked at the machine that had killed their friends. It was the first time most of them had seen a tiger this close without being in the process of trying to survive it. Photographs taken that afternoon showed them climbing on the hull, sitting on the turret, grinning with the specific expression of men who have just discovered something extraordinary and are still processing what it means. One of them found the driver's hatch open. He climbed in. The starter cranked. The engine caught. The tiger, which had been sitting quiet in the olive grove for days, roared back to life under an American hand. Word of the find moved up the chain of command with unusual speed. In North Africa, the American Ordnance Department maintained a small unit specifically tasked with the collection and evaluation of enemy equipment. Its officers took possession of the Tiger, gave it a designation in their records, and photographed it from every angle. In the tactical numbering system used by the Schwere Panzerabteilung 501, this particular vehicle carried the number 712 on its turret. It would be remembered by that number for the rest of its existence. Tiger 712. The Ordnance Department cable reporting the find reached the desk of an American colonel at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, a facility on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay that had been the United States Army's principal weapons evaluation center for a quarter of a century. The colonel's name was George Burling Jarrett. He was 44 years old. He was not a man who grinned at found equipment. He was an ordnance officer in the specific sense of the word. An engineer whose entire professional life had been organized around the systematic study of weapons, and he understood immediately what the Tunis discovery represented. Every Tiger the Allies had encountered until now had been encountered in combat. Every Tiger they had inspected had been a wreck, burned, its armor blackened by internal fires, its interior a study in what happens to a machine when the powder in its own ammunition detonates. Nobody in the Allied camp had ever taken apart a functioning Tiger. Nobody had measured its armor with calipers rather than shell holes. Nobody had run its engine on a test stand. Nobody had studied its transmission on a workbench under electric light. Jarrett sent the order the same day. Ship it. Ship the Tiger to Maryland. The tank was loaded onto a flat car in the port of Tunis, taken by rail to the harbor, hoisted onto the deck of a Liberty ship, and dispatched across the Atlantic. It arrived at Aberdeen in the summer of 1943. The engineers who took delivery of Tiger 712 had been reading reports from Tunisia for 4 months. They knew what the 88mm gun had done to American Shermans in the mountain passes. They knew what the frontal armor had absorbed. They knew the kill ratios that were beginning to reach American headquarters. They knew the fear. They did not know what was inside. That is what they were about to learn. And what they were about to learn would not confirm what they expected. It would be stranger than that. It would tell them something about the war itself, about the philosophy behind the machine they were dismantling, that would still be shaping American tank design 50 years later, in the deserts of Kuwait, in the guns of the M1 Abrams. But that was 50 years away. For now, there was only the machine in the olive grove, transported across an ocean, waiting on the concrete of a proving ground in Maryland to be taken apart. And on the Eastern Front, in a tiger that ran on bread paste and improvisation and the accumulated attention of a young tank commander who had once nearly pushed one of these machines off a rail-flat car, Alfred Rubbel was about to go to war. The autumn of 1943 arrived in Maryland with a bank of grey cloud that hung over the Chesapeake for weeks. In a hangar at Aberdeen Proving Ground, under electric lights that ran 24 hours a day, a team of American engineers was doing something that had never been done before in the English-speaking world. They were taking apart a functioning Tiger. The hangar had been cleared of everything except the tank and the tools required to work on it. The Tiger sat on a concrete pad in the center of the space, its tracks removed, its hull washed clean of the North African dust that had covered it when it arrived in the port of Baltimore. The men who moved around it wore coveralls and carried notebooks. They measured with calipers. They photographed every fastener before they removed it. They labeled every component with tags tied on with wire, so that when the tank was reassembled, every bolt would return to the hole it had come from. Their first work was the gun. The 88mm KWK-36 came out of the turret on the second day. It weighed nearly a ton. The Americans laid it on a wooden cradle and measured it end to end. The barrel was 56 calibers long. The rifling was clean. The breech mechanism, when they opened it, worked with the precision of a bank vault. They took the optical sight, the Turmzielfernrohr 9B manufactured by Leitz in Wetzlar, and mounted it on a test rig. When they looked through it at a target 400 meters away, they saw the target the way a man sees a bird through binoculars in clear morning light. It was better than anything they were putting in a Sherman. It was better than anything they were building at all. The engineers took the gun to the firing range on the far side of the proving ground and shot it at plates of American armor steel. At 1,000 meters, the standard armor-piercing round punched through 120 millimeters of rolled homogeneous plate. The frontal armor of a Sherman was 76 millimeters. The math was straightforward. At any range a Sherman could see a Tiger. The Tiger could kill the Sherman. The reverse was not true. The Sherman's 75mm gun could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at any distance a battlefield would produce. This was not a discovery, this was a confirmation. The engineers had been reading reports from Tunisia for months. Now they had numbers to attach to the reports. They wrote them down. 2,500 kilometers east, in Ukraine. Alfred Rubbel was learning the same numbers from the other direction. His unit, the Schwere Panzerabteilung 503, had been fighting since the summer, first in the great tank battles around Kursk in July, then in the long retreat that had followed. Rubbel had graduated during those months from gunner to tank commander. He had a Tiger of his own now. He had a crew. The gunner was a corporal named Werner Wendt. The loader was a young private whose name Rubbel would later record only as Kramer. The radio operator sat in the hull beside the driver. The driver was a man named Walter Escherig. Escherig was older than the rest of them by a decade. He had been a mechanic before the war, in a garage in Hamburg, and he had come into the army with hands that already knew what to do with an engine that was misbehaving. In the year they served together, Rubbel would come to understand that Escherig was the reason the Tiger kept running. The Tiger's engine was a Maybach HL 230. It was a 23-liter V12 gasoline-powered, capable of producing 700 horsepower under ideal conditions. The engineers at Aberdeen, when they got to it that autumn, took it out of the hull with a chain hoist and set it on a stand and stared at it for a long time. It was a beautiful piece of machinery. It was also, they realized as they began to work on it, a machine that had been built to specifications that assumed the world would cooperate with it. The cylinder heads used cork gaskets to seal the combustion chambers. The cork was of the highest quality, precisely cut, machined to tolerances that any German factory in 1943 could still meet. When the engine ran within its designed operating temperature, the cork held perfectly. When the engine overheated, which it did, particularly in warm weather or under sustained high-power operation, the cork burned. When the cork burned, the engine lost compression. When it lost compression, it stopped. The Aberdeen engineers wrote this down. In Ukraine, Escherig had been dealing with it since summer. His solution was not in any manual. When the cylinder seals burned through and the tank began to lose oil, Escherig would climb out, open his ration pack, take a piece of dark army bread, and chew it in his mouth until it was a warm, dense paste. Then he would climb up on the engine deck, open the compartment, and press the bread paste into the cylinder gaps as an improvised sealant. The bread would harden as it cooled. It would hold, imperfectly, for a few hours, long enough to get the Tiger back to a maintenance point, or to the next hedgerow, or to whatever the next thing was that needed to be reached. Rubbel later described this practice with the flat honesty of a man who understood exactly what it meant. The most sophisticated tank in the world, the machine that induced phobia in Allied crews, the vehicle that Germany was betting the war on, was being kept in service on the Eastern Front by a Hamburg garage mechanic chewing bread and pressing it into a cylinder head with his thumb. At Aberdeen, the engineers moved on to the suspension. The Tiger used a system of interleaved road wheels, developed by an engineer named Heinrich Kniepkamp. The wheels were arranged in overlapping rows across the width of the hull, 3 wheels deep on each side. The system distributed the tank's 57 tons across a larger area of track surface than any conventional suspension could achieve. It gave the Tiger better cross-country performance in soft ground than any other tank in the war. It was, on the drawing board, brilliant. In service, it was a nightmare. To replace an inner road wheel, one that had been damaged by a mine or worn out by hard use, the crew had to first remove every outer wheel between the damaged one and the end of the hull. Up to 9 wheels off, in some cases, to reach 1 wheel. Each wheel weighed over 100 kilograms. Each wheel was secured by bolts that required specific tools and specific torque. The procedure, Rubbel wrote, could take a full day. In winter, with frozen mud packed between the wheels, it could take longer. The Aberdeen engineers timed the procedure using the American mechanics they had assigned to the project. They wrote the numbers down. Then they moved to the transmission. The Tiger's transmission was called the Maybach Olvar. It was a semi-automatic pre-selector unit with 8 forward gears and 4 reverse. It was, for its era, an engineering marvel. It allowed the driver of a 57-ton tank to shift gears with the ease of a man driving a passenger sedan. The problem was where it was located. The transmission sat at the front of the hull, forward of the driver's compartment. This placement had been chosen for a specific reason. It allowed the fighting compartment behind it to sit lower in the hull, which reduced the tank's overall silhouette and made room for a larger turret ring, which in turn allowed the enormous 88mm gun to be mounted in a turret that could rotate. Every design choice had a reason. This one had a good reason. But when the transmission failed, and it did fail, because it was carrying more power and more torque than any tank transmission had been asked to carry before it, the crew could not reach it. To remove the transmission of a Tiger, you first had to remove the turret. The turret weighed 11 metric tons. To lift 11 metric tons off a tank hull, you needed a crane with a lifting capacity of at least 15 tons. In a rear area workshop with proper facilities, this was possible. In a forward repair depot, in the mud, in the rain, in the specific conditions that a battlefield actually produced, you did not have such a crane. A Tiger with a broken transmission in the forward area was finished, not destroyed, not killed by enemy action, dead, sitting on the side of a road, waiting for equipment that might not come. And in the meantime, unable to move, unable to fight, requiring the attention of an entire recovery detail to either drag it to a rear area or destroy it in place. The Aberdeen engineers stared at the transmission. Then they walked around to the front of the hull and stared at where it fit. Then they went back to their notebooks. The report they were writing was becoming something they had not initially expected it to be. The Tiger's weaknesses, they realized as they went deeper into the machine, were not mistakes. They were not oversights. They were not the result of German engineers being sloppy or hurried or incompetent. They were the direct consequence of the tank's strengths. Every design choice that had made the Tiger the most lethal weapon on the battlefield had also made it harder to keep running. The transmission was at the front because the fighting compartment needed to be low. The suspension was interleaved because the weight needed to be distributed. The tolerances were tight because the precision was required. Each decision was defensible. Each decision made the Tiger extraordinary in the conditions it had been designed for. Each decision made the Tiger, in the conditions the war actually produced, increasingly impossible to sustain. The engineers wrote this down too. This part of the report was different from the technical measurements. This part was a conclusion. Then they went to the numbers. To build one, Tiger required approximately 300,000 man-hours of skilled industrial labor. To build one Sherman required approximately 10,000. The cost of a single Tiger, in Reichsmarks, was more than twice the cost of a Panzer IV. Germany, across the entire war, produced 1,347 Tigers. The United States, across the same period, produced approximately 49,000 Shermans. On any given day in 1944, the Wehrmacht records showed Tiger units reporting operational readiness rates that often fell to 50% or lower. Half the Tigers on the roster were sitting broken somewhere behind the lines. Sherman readiness, across the same period, was consistently far higher. In individual combat, the Tiger destroyed Allied tanks at a ratio that battalion records placed at roughly 5-1 over the course of the war. The math looked good for Germany when you stopped there. You could not stop there, given the production differential, given the man-hours committed. The ratio Germany needed to break even on Tiger production was much higher than 5-1. The Tigers would have had to destroy more than a dozen Allied tanks for every Tiger lost, just to make the arithmetic of steel and labor come out neutral. And that was before you counted the fuel, the maintenance, the trained crews, the workshops, the 15-ton cranes that were sitting in rear area depots when they should have been at the front. The math never worked. Not in Tunisia, not at Kursk, not in Normandy. It was not a math problem that could be solved by better tactics or better crews or better generals. It was structural. It was inside the machine. Every Tiger that rolled out of the Henschel plant in Kassel was a Tiger that was from the moment of its birth, losing a race it could not win. At Aberdeen, the engineers finished the report in late 1943 and sent it up the chain. It went to Ordnance. It went to Armored Command. It went to the men in Washington who were making decisions about what tanks America would build for the rest of the war. The report did not change the Sherman. The Sherman was already in mass production. American factories were building it at rates German industry could not match. What the report changed was understanding. Before Tiger 712 was disassembled at Aberdeen, American officers understood the Tiger as a tactical problem, a formidable opponent in individual combat, requiring specific tactics to defeat, flanking movements, combined arms, avoiding the long-range engagements where the 88 had its decisive advantage. After the Aberdeen report, American officers understood the Tiger as a strategic problem, a weapon whose tactical superiority was being consumed continuously and irreversibly by its own design, a weapon that was, in the specific sense of the word, self-defeating. Not because the Germans were bad at building tanks, because the Germans were too good at building this particular tank, for a war that had lasted longer than the specifications had assumed. In the winter of 1943 in Berlin, Albert Speer was fighting the same fight from the other direction. Speer had been appointed Reich Minister of Armaments in February 1942, after his predecessor Fritz Todt died in a plane crash. He was 36 years old when he took the job. An architect by training, not an engineer or a soldier. He had brought to the ministry an outsider's willingness to ask questions that the professionals had stopped asking. One of those questions was about the Tiger. Speer's argument, preserved in memoranda that survive today in the German Federal Archives, was that Germany could not afford to build weapons this expensive. He wanted to shift production toward more Panzer IVs, which were simpler, cheaper, and available in useful numbers. He wanted to reduce the Tiger program, or at least stop expanding it. He faced two obstacles. The first was Hitler, who believed in quality over quantity, and who had personally championed the Tiger since 1941. The second was the officers of the Panzerwaffe, who had seen what a Tiger could do in combat and wanted more of them. The officers were not wrong. What they had seen was real. What Speer was arguing was that what they had seen would not be enough. The math, again, was not on the officers' side. The math was on Speer's side. But the men making the decision were not making it on the math. Ruble, in Ukraine, was not thinking about production ratios or Reichsmarks or the memoranda circulating in Berlin. He was thinking about the sound of his engine. He was thinking about whether the bread paste would hold until the next fuel dump. He was thinking about the specific way the temperature gauge on the Maybach would climb during a long summer march, and about the specific point at which he had to order Escherich to shut it down before it destroyed itself. He was, in the language of the men who wrote the Aberdeen report, part of the maintenance problem. He was also the only reason the machine was still running. There is a photograph of him from this period. He is standing on the front slope of his Tiger, in a black Panzer jacket, looking at the camera without smiling. He is 22 years old. He looks older. He has already survived Kursk. He has already survived the retreat from the Dnieper. He has already buried men from his original crew and taken on replacements he barely knows. Behind him, the Tiger, its side armor scarred by hits that failed to penetrate, its track marked with the mud of 3 countries. The engine, at that moment, running. Because Escherich had chewed the bread that morning. Because the seals had held. For now. In early July of 1944, Alfred Rubbel arrived in Normandy. The Schwere Panzerabteilung 503 had been withdrawn from the Eastern Front in the spring, refitted at Ohrdruf with a mix of Tiger I and the newer Tiger II, and moved west to help contain the Allied breakout from the beachhead. Rubbel came off the train in a country he had never seen, in a summer that was warmer than any he could remember from Russia, into a landscape that no one in his battalion had been trained to fight in. The Norman Bocage was the opposite of the Tiger's designed combat environment. On the steppes of Ukraine, Rubbel had engaged Soviet tanks at 1,500 meters, at 2,000 meters, at distances where his 88mm gun could kill the enemy before the enemy knew he was there. In the Bocage, the fields were the size of a suburban backyard. The hedgerows were walls of packed earth and root systems 6 feet high, planted 1,000 years ago and reinforced every generation since. Engagement ranges were measured in meters, not kilometers. A Tiger crew could not see a target more than 100 meters away because there was nothing more than 100 meters away that was not behind a hedge. The Tiger's advantages disappeared in that landscape. Its long-range gunnery was irrelevant when everything was close. Its heavy frontal armor was less useful when Shermans could come around the corner of a hedge at 30 meters and put a round into the side of the turret before anyone in the Tiger knew they were there. Its weight, which had been an asset on the open ground of the Eastern Front, became an active liability. Norman bridges had been built for farm carts and horse teams. A Tiger crossing one of them made the wood groan. Some of them did not hold. The vehicle had been designed for the wrong war, and now, in the last summer, it would fight. It was being asked to operate in terrain that had been designed, in a manner of speaking, against it. Rubbel's battalion arrived in France with its full authorized strength of Tigers. Within weeks, through a combination of combat losses and mechanical failures, that strength was dropping fast. Replacements were arriving from Germany at a fraction of the rate at which the tanks were being lost. The repair facilities that had been within a day's drive of the front on the Eastern Front were now much further behind the lines, and the roads between were being patrolled by Allied fighter bombers who would attack anything on wheels or tracks that they saw moving in daylight. The 15-ton crane, which had always been theoretical in forward areas, was now essentially imaginary. There was one, somewhere. It was rarely close enough to matter. Tigers that broke down in Normandy in the summer of 1944 sat where they broke. They sat for a day. They sat for 2 days. And then, usually, they were destroyed by their own crews. Because the Allies were coming. And there was no time left. This was the thing the men in Rubbel's battalion had trouble getting their minds around at first. They were not losing Tigers only in combat. They were losing Tigers to the road. In the individual engagements that summer, Tigers continued to destroy Shermans at the ratios they always had. Michael Wittmann's action at Villers-Bocage on the 13th of June, in which a small group of Tigers led by Wittmann destroyed roughly a dozen British vehicles in a matter of minutes, was not an anomaly. It was what a Tiger did when it was placed in a good position and given a target. The gun still worked. The optics still worked. The crews were still trained. What was different was everything around the engagement. For every Sherman that Rubbel's battalion destroyed, more Shermans arrived at the front from the beachhead. For every Tiger that Rubbel's battalion lost, whether to enemy fire or to a broken final drive on a country lane, a replacement did not arrive for weeks. The pool of Shermans in Normandy grew every day. The pool of Tigers shrank every day. The math the Aberdeen engineers had documented the year before was operating in real time. In the fields and hedgerows of a country Rubbel had never seen before, he arrived to fight in it. By August, his battalion was conducting delaying actions. By September, it was fighting on the German border. By late 1944, it was fighting inside Germany itself. The retreat that had been inconceivable when the Tiger was designed had become the daily reality of the men who crewed it. Rubbel later wrote about one afternoon during this period, in a passage that he chose not to date and not to locate precisely. His Tiger had thrown a track link on a road he did not name. Escherig was under the hull, working on the sprocket with a wrench and a hammer. Rubbel was standing on the road, watching the western sky for Allied aircraft. The engine of the tank was still running, at idle, because they did not know whether they would be able to restart it if they shut it down. 20 minutes into the repair, one of the crew members inside the tank, listening on the radio, called up through the hatch that Allied armor had been reported 5 kilometers to the west. Advancing, Rubbel looked at Escherig. Escherig looked back at him. There was not time to complete the repair. There was also not, in the specific circumstances of that road, on that afternoon, a way to move the tank. The recovery vehicle that would have towed it was somewhere in the rear. The tow cables that his own crew carried were not going to survive dragging 57 tons across country. Rubbel gave the order that the men of the Schwere Panzerabteilung 503 had been giving with increasing frequency for weeks. He ordered his crew to set the demolition charges. The charges were standard: explosive on the engine block, explosive in the ammunition bins, a delay fuse cut for 3 minutes. Rubbel and his crew walked away from the Tiger down the road to the east. Behind them, the engine of the tank continued to idle. And then, when the fuse burned down, it stopped. The sound of the explosion, Rubbel wrote, was not particularly loud. It was the sound of a machine ending. He did not look back. He rejoined his unit and continued to serve to the end. The war ended in May of 1945. Rubbel was taken into captivity during the final collapse. He spent a period in a prisoner of war camp, was released, and returned to a country that had been physically and institutionally destroyed. He was 23 years old. He had no formal profession. What he had was a set of skills that had been useful in a war that no longer existed, and a specific expertise in a machine that had been defeated, in part, by the design philosophy that had produced it. In the early 1950s, the Federal Republic of Germany was authorized to rebuild an army as part of NATO's defense against the Soviet Union. The new army was called the Bundeswehr. It needed tanks. It also needed men who understood what tanks had to do and what tanks could not do, in the specific conditions that European warfare would produce. Rubbel joined the Bundeswehr and spent his post-war career in the Armored Corps, working with the generation of vehicles that Germany built for a different kind of war. The first tank the Bundeswehr designed and built for its own use was the Leopard 1. It entered service in 1965. It weighed 40 tons, not 57. Its transmission was at the back of the hull. To reach the transmission for repair, a mechanic opened a hatch in the rear deck. The turret did not have to be removed. The suspension used torsion bars and a conventional wheel arrangement. To replace a road wheel, a mechanic removed that wheel. He did not have to remove the wheels next to it. The Leopard 1 was exported to Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Italy, Turkey, Greece, Canada, Australia, and other countries. It became one of the most successful post-war tank designs in the world. The men who designed it had learned specific lessons from the war they had fought. Some of those lessons were the lessons of men like Rubbel, the specific lessons of a soldier who had kept a Tiger running on bread pace for 2 years, and who had walked away from the last one on a country road in Germany because there was no crane, and no cable, and no time. Rubbel retired from military service. He wrote his memoirs. He did not regret the Tiger. He did not, in any of his writing, argue that Germany should have built the Tiger differently, or that the men who had designed it had been wrong to design it the way they did. What he argued was simpler. The Tiger, he said, was the finest tank of the war. It was also a tank that had been built for a war that had not lasted long enough to be short. In a 6-month war, the Tiger would have been decisive. In a 4-year war, The Tiger had been consumed by the arithmetic of its own excellence. This was not a criticism of the machine. It was an observation about the specific relationship between the machine and the war it had been asked to fight. He died in 2001. He was 80 years old. Colonel George Burling Jarrett, the American officer who had ordered Tiger 712 shipped to Aberdeen in the summer of 1943, retired from the army after the war. He had spent his career studying weapons, and after his retirement, he founded a small ordnance museum in Pennsylvania, where he continued to write and to lecture until his death in the 1970s. The report that his engineers had produced on Tiger 712 remained in the Ordnance Department archives, cited occasionally in technical literature, largely forgotten by the public that had never known it existed. The tank itself, Tiger 712, remained at Aberdeen Proving Ground for 6 decades. When Aberdeen closed as a proving ground in 2010, the tank was moved to the National Armor and Cavalry Museum, which is now located at Fort Benning, Georgia. It sits there today. It is the only Tiger 1 on American soil. It is not operational. The engine, which the American engineers ran on a test stand in the autumn of 1943, has not been started in more than 70 years. But the tank is not a wreck. It is intact. Standing next to it, a visitor can still see the tactical number 712 painted on the side of the turret, in the specific stencil style that the German army used in 1943. A visitor can still see the specific machine that a group of American soldiers, veterans of Kasserine, found abandoned in an olive grove outside Tunis in the second week of May, 1943, and drove out into the sunlight, with their hands still shaking from what they had learned about how close they had come. What the Americans had learned from that machine, in the end, was not how to defeat it in combat. American doctrine already had answers to that question, imperfect answers, but functional ones. What they had learned was something larger. They had learned that the war they were fighting was not going to be decided by which side had the better tank. It was going to be decided by which side had a tank that could be there when the battle started. Every day. In every weather. On every road. Repaired by men with wrenches, not cranes. Fueled by supply lines that were not going to be cut. Produced in factories that were not going to be bombed. Delivered to units that were not going to run out. The Sherman was that tank, not because it was the better machine, because it was there. The Tiger was, on any measure of individual excellence, the finer weapon. The Aberdeen engineers documented that. The kill ratios documented that. Rubble's memoirs documented that. Nobody who has studied the question in 8 decades since has argued otherwise, but the finest tank in the world was not enough. It was not enough in Tunisia, where the men of the 1st Infantry Division walked through an olive grove and found a machine that had been abandoned because the war had moved faster than its crew could destroy it. It was not enough in Ukraine, where Alfred Rubble kept his engine running on chewed bread and the accumulated attention of a driver named Walter Escherig. It was not enough in Normandy, where Rubble set a demolition charge on his own tank because the road was clear behind him and the enemy was 5 kilometers to the west, and there was no crane, and there was no time. Germany built the perfect tank. America built a tank that was enough. Perfect lost. Enough won. That was the war. That was the entire war, in a single sentence. Everything else, the great tank battles, the doctrines, the technologies, the memoirs written after the guns went silent, was footnote. The Sherman was there, in the numbers that mattered, in the places that mattered, on the days that mattered. And the Tiger was not. Alfred Rubble understood it by the end. He spent the rest of his career around tanks that would be there. He did not regret what he had built before. He simply knew what it had cost. Tiger 712 sites at Fort Benning today. It is quiet. It is intact. It is the specific machine that a colonel named Jarrett looked at in a report in 1943 and understood, before anyone else in the American army, what the German war effort had done to itself. The report is in the archives. The tank is in the museum. The war is over. But every time a nation, anywhere in the world, decides how to build its next weapon and has to choose between perfect and enough, the same question is being asked. It was asked in Detroit in 1941. It was asked in Kassel in 1942. It is being asked, right now, in engineering offices in a dozen countries whose names would not have meant anything to the men in the olive grove outside Tunis. Do you build the finest weapon in the world, or do you build the weapon that will be there? The Tiger was the finest weapon in the world. The Sherman lacked many of the Tiger's advantages, but its reliability, production scale, and logistical support ensured that it remained on the battlefield in overwhelming numbers throughout the war.